Chapter 22. Apparently, the word had been circulated on the spacious deck that as soon as this belated passenger arrived, the barge would put off, for much interest was shown at the rail when the chair drew up beside the gangway. There was some annoyance, too, especially on the patrician faces of a group of senators, unaccustomed to waiting the convenience of a tardy tribune. The beautiful barge moved quietly away from the wharf, and the passengers, a score or more, disposed themselves in the luxurious chairs grouped under the gay awning. A light and lazy breeze ruffled the blue bay. The two banks of long oars swung rhythmically, gracefully, to the metallic beat of the boatswain's hammers. Click, clack. A crimson sail slowly climbed the forward mast, and after a few indecisive flutters, resolved to aid the slaves below. Marcellus found a seat quite apart from the others, and moodily surveyed the distant wharfs of Puteoli on the mainland. After a while, a dozen sleek and nearly naked Nubians came up from the hold, bearing silver trays high above their shaved brown heads, and spread fanwise among the passengers. The emperor's midday hospitality was generous, but Marcellus was not hungry. The Augusta, at her present speed, should be able to reach Rome by late afternoon of the day after tomorrow. For the first time in his life, Marcellus had no desire to go home. There would be endless explanations to make. His father would be disappointed, hurt, exasperated. His mother would resort to tears. Lucia would try to be sympathetic, but it would be sheer pity. He attempted to imagine a conversation with Tullus. They had been very close and confidential. What had they to talk about were they to meet now? Tullus would inquire rather gingerly what all he had been up to these past 2 years. Was there any conceivable answer to that question? As the afternoon wore on, Marcellus's disinclination to return to Rome was crystallizing to a definite decision, and he began to consider alternatives. At sunset he sauntered to the captain's quarters and inquired casually whether the Augusta was calling at any of the coast ports before reaching Ostia, and was advised that she was making no stops. Not even at Ostia. He was hungry at dinner time. A smart breeze had risen as the twilight came on, and the deck was abandoned. Marcellus went to his cabin, opened his largest bag, and took out the Galilean robe, folding it as compactly as possible. Wrapping it around his leather wallet, he secured it with a strap. The wallet was heavy. On the evening he had left home, his father had sent Marcipor down to the galley with a parting gift. Distraught, Marcellus had not opened it until he and Demetrius were on board the Clio. He was amazed. As if to make amends for his part in the estrangement, the senator had provided him with a very large sum of money. It was all in gold pieces of high denomination. Marcellus had been touched by his father's lavish generosity. Saddened, too, for it was almost as if the senator had said that his son would now be free to go his own way. Removing his toga, Marcellus rolled it up and stuffed it into the big bag to replace the robe. Then, having refastened the bag, he stretched it out on his berth and waited for the time to pass. Most of his thoughts were about Diana and his loss of her. Occasionally he glanced at the hourglass at his bedside table. 4 times he reversed it. If his computations were correct, the Augusta would round the promontory off Capua about midnight. There was only one sentry patrolling the afterdeck when Marcellus strolled aimlessly toward the stern, with his package buckled to the back of his heavy tunic sash. The sentry paid him but little attention as he stood at the rail. Doubtless the restless passenger had come out to look at the stars. Perhaps a gratuity might be forthcoming if a little service were offered. A light blinked in the darkness a mile away. "That is the lighthouse at Capua, sir," volunteered the sentry. "Yes," said Marcellus, indifferently. "May I bring you a chair, sir?" "Yes." The water was not uncomfortably cold. Marcellus had let himself into it feet first, without a splash. There was a gratifyingly long time before the sentry gave the alarm. Evidently he had made quite a business of finding a comfortable chair for the tribune. Now there were other shouts. The boatswain had stopped beating on his anvil. The Augusta could not be more than 2 stadia away, but she was only a row of dim lights, her black hull already blended into the darkness. Marcellus turned his face toward the shore and proceeded with long overarm strokes to pull Capua nearer. After a while, flipping over on his back, he looked for the Augusta. Only the lamp of the masthead was visible. Doubtless the barge had resumed her journey. It was the longest swim that Marcellus had ever undertaken. His clothing weighted him. The packet of gold was heavy. Once he thought seriously of tugging off the heavy silk tunic that dragged at his arms, but the threat of arriving at Capua clad only in trunks and a sheer subucula induced him to struggle on. He tried to unfasten his sandal straps, but found it impossible. The beacon in the lighthouse seemed to be growing brighter. He hoped he was not imagining this, for he was getting very tired. At length, the choppy waves began to smooth out into long combers. Lower lights shone feebly along the shore. The surf grew rougher. Marcellus could hear it crash against the sea wall. He shifted his course leftward to avoid the lighthouse escarpment and the huddle of docks. It was hard going across the riptide. His lungs were beginning to hurt. A great wave carried him forward, and retreating left him a temporary footing. Bracing against the weight of its undertow, he held his ground until it had run out. All but spent, he staggered toward the beach and flung himself down in the lee of a fishing dory, his teeth chattering with the cold. It occurred to him that he should feel immensely gratified over the success of his difficult adventure, but found himself indifferent. Wringing the water out of his clothes, Marcellus vigorously swung his arms to warm himself and plodded up wearily through the deepening sand until he found a dry spot that still retained something of its daytime heat. There he spent the rest of the night, sleeping lightly and anxious for the dawn. When the sun rose, he spread out the robe on the sand. It dried quickly, and he put it on over his damp tunic, comforted by its warmth. He was in better spirits now, glad to be alive. At a fisherman's hut he asked for something to eat, but he was eyed with suspicion by the surly old couple who told him they had no food. Up farther in the town, at a sailor's inn, he was crudely served with black bread and a greasy pottage. Dishevelled loungers gathered about him to ask questions, which he made no effort to answer satisfactorily. When he opened his wallet to pay, they drew in closer about him, eyes wide with avaricious interest. But as he overtopped them all and appeared unalarmed by their curiosity, no one made a move to detain him. Proceeding through the dirty little town, he turned eastward on a dusty, deserted highway. His sandals were drying now, and felt more comfortable, though they had begun to look quite disreputable. Marcellus was bareheaded, having lost his bandeau in the sea. Nobody could have mistaken him for a tribune. The expensive leather wallet was inappropriate, and he concealed it in the breast of his tunic. At the first village, 3 miles inland, he spent a few coppers for a well-worn goatskin bag of considerable capacity, emptied his wallet into it, and later dropped the wallet into an abandoned cistern. Before reaching the next village, he took off his tunic, wrapped it around the package of gold that had nearly drowned him last night, and bought another off the wash-line of a vintner's cottage, paying the owner 10 sesterces, for which he was so well satisfied that he and his wife chuckled behind Marcellus's back as he moved away. The brown tunic was coarsely woven, and had seen hard service, but it was clean. The sun was high now, and Marcellus carried the Galilean robe folded over his arm. He frequently paused to rest in the shade beside the descending stream that grew more and more active as the grade stiffened toward the foothills of the distant, snow-capped Apennines. He had no plans, but he was not depressed, nor was he lonesome. Indeed, he had a curious sense of well-being. The country was beautiful, the trees were in full leaf, the nesting birds were busy and happy, the wild flowers along the bank of the lively stream were exquisite in their fragile beauty. Marcellus drew deep sighs of contentment, gratified but surprised that he could feel so free of any care. He regarded his own appearance with amusement. He had never looked like this before. He stroked his stubbly jaw and wondered whether a razor could be found in one of the villages. If not, no matter. That night, with the robe for a cover, he slept in the open, remembering, as he drifted off, something Justus had said of Jesus' homelessness. The foxes had holes, the birds had nests, but Jesus had no bed, no pillow. Marcellus drew the robe closer about him. It was not heavy, but it was warm and comforting. He fell asleep thinking of Diana, but not hopelessly. In the morning he rose, refreshed, bathed in the cold stream and breakfasted on wild strawberries. The stone mileposts had been announcing with increasing optimism that travellers on this uphill road were nearing Arpino. Marcellus cudgelled his memory. What did he know about Arpino? Delicious little melons, Arpino melons. And exactly the right time for them, too. The road was wider now and showed better care. The fences were well kept. On either side of the highway, vineyards, the plentiful grapes still green, were being cultivated and irrigated. The traffic on the road was increasing. Here were the melon fields, acres and acres of ripening melons, a procession of high-boxed carts laden with melons, dozens and scores of men, women and children scattered through the fields, all bent to the task of gathering melons. Nearing a busy open gate, Marcellus sat down on the stone fence and viewed the scene. The little town at the top of the rise seemed to be built on a comparatively level terrain, sheltered on the east by a sheer wall of rock that based one of the loftiest peaks of the range. The village itself, or as much as could be seen of it, was composed of small, square cottages crowded closely together. North of this cramped huddle of houses, and on slightly higher ground, the red-tiled roofs of a quite imposing villa shone through the trees surrounding it, doubtless the home of the big man who owned the melon business. After a while, Marcellus decided to move on up to the village. The swarthy overseer at the open gate, importantly checking the emerging carts on a slate held in the crook of his hand, hailed him. Was he looking for work? What kind of work? Marcellus wanted to know. The overseer jabbed a thumb toward the melon field. 2 sesterces, he said gruffly, and a cot and food. But the day is nearly half done, sir, said Marcellus. Perhaps 1 sesterce would be sufficient. I have had no experience in picking melons. The bewildered overseer rested the heavy slate on his hip, spat thoughtfully, and stared at the newcomer, apparently lacking a formula for dealing with this unprecedented situation. While he deliberated, Marcellus picked up one of the big willow baskets from a heap piled beside the gate, and was moving off toward his new occupation. "Wait, fellow," called the overseer. "Can you read and write?" Marcellus admitted that he could. "And compute?" Yes, Marcellus could compute. "Queso has discharged his scrivener." "Who is Queso?" inquired Marcellus, so unimpressed that the overseer drew himself to full height before disclaiming, with a sweep of his arm embracing the fields and the town, that Appius Queso owned everything in sight. He pointed toward the villa. "Go up there," he said, "and ask for Queso. Tell him Vibiscus sent you. If he does not hire you, come back and work on the melons." "I'd much rather work on the melons," said Marcellus. The overseer blinked a few times uncertainly. "A scrivener is better paid and has better food," he said, slightly nettled by the traveller's stupidity. "I suppose so," nodded Marcellus, adding with cool obstinacy, "I should prefer to pick melons." "Doesn't it make any difference to you, fellow," snapped the overseer, "whether you make 2 sesterces or 10? "Not much," confessed Marcellus. "I'm not especially interested in money, and it's quite beautiful out here in the open, with that majestic mountain in sight." Vibiscus shielded his eyes, gazed up at the towering peak beyond Arpino, frowned, looked up again, grinned a little, and rubbed his chin. "You aren't crazy, are you?" he asked soberly, and when Marcellus had said he didn't think so, the overseer told him to go on up to the villa. Queso had the traditional arrogance of a short-statured man of wealth and authority. He was of a pugnacious stockiness, 50, smooth-shaven, expensively dressed, with carefully groomed, grizzled hair and amazingly well-preserved teeth. It was immediately evident that he was accustomed to barking impatient questions and drowning timorous replies in a deluge of belittling sarcasm. Marcellus had stood quietly waiting while the restless, bumptious fellow marched heavily up and down the length of the cool atrium, shouting his unfavourable opinions of scriveners in general, and his most recent one in particular. They were all alike, dishonest, lazy, incompetent. None of them was worth his salt. Every time Queso passed the applicant, he paused to glare at him belligerently. At first, Marcellus had regarded this noisy exhibition with an impassive face, but as it continued, he found himself unable any longer to repress a broad grin. Queso stopped in his tracks and scowled. Marcellus chuckled good-humouredly.
"It is to laugh, is it?"
snarled Queso, jutting his chin. "Yes," drawled Marcellus, "it is to laugh. Maybe it wouldn't be funny if I were hungry and in dire need of work. I suppose that's the way you talk to everybody who can't afford to talk back." Queso's mouth hung open and his eyes narrowed with unbelief. "But go right on." Marcellus waved a hand negligently. "Don't mind me, I'll listen. Do you care if I sit down? I've been walking all morning and I'm tired." He eased into a luxurious chair and sighed. Queso stalked toward him and stood with feet wide apart.
"Who are you, fellow?"
he demanded.
"Well, sir,"
replied Marcellus with a smile,
"while your question asked in that tone deserves no answer at all, I am an unemployed wayfarer. Your man Vibiscus insisted that I offer my services as a scrivener. Realizing that this is your busiest season, I thought I might do you a good turn by helping out for a few days."
Queso ran his stubby fingers through his greying hair and sat down on the edge of an adjacent lectus. "And you, sir," went on Marcellus, instead of giving me an opportunity to explain my call, began to pour forth. His eyes drifted about through the well-appointed atrium. "If I may venture to say so, you probably do not deserve to live in such a beautiful villa. Your manner of treating strangers doesn't seem to belong here. In these lovely surroundings, there should be nothing but quiet courtesy and goodwill." Queso, stunned by the stranger's impudence, had listened with amazement. Now he came to his feet, his face contorted with anger.
"You can't say things like that to me,"
he shouted.
"Who do you think you are? You insult me in my own house? Yet you look like a common vagrant, a beggar."
"I'm not a beggar, sir," said Marcellus quietly.
"Get out,"
snapped Queso. Marcellus rose, smiled, bowed, walked slowly toward the open peristyle and down the broad marble steps, Queso following him as far as the portico. Sauntering through the village, he went back to the melon field, aware that he was being trailed at a little distance by a tall Macedonian. Vibiscus viewed his return with much interest. "Queso didn't want you?" he inquired. Marcellus shook his head, picked up a basket and walked through the field until he came to the first little group of labourers. They glanced up with sour curiosity. One old man straightened with a painful grimace and looked him over with the utmost frankness. "It was a fine day," observed Marcellus pleasantly. "For a backache," retorted the old man. This drew a sullen chortle from the neighbours, one of whom, a scowling old woman of 20, bitterly admonished him that he'd better work a while and then tell them how fine a day it was. Conceding this point, so cheerfully that the sulky girl gave him a reluctant but pathetically childish smile, Marcellus doffed his robe, folding it carefully and laying it on the ground beside the goatskin bag, and fell to work with enthusiasm. "Not so fast, not so fast," cautioned the old man. "Queso won't pay you any better for killing yourself." "And Vibiscus will be bawling at us for shirking," added a cloddish fellow up the line a little way. "These are the finest melons in the world," remarked Marcellus, stopping to wipe his dripping forehead. "It's a pleasure to work with the finest of something. Not many people have a chance to do that. Sunshine, blue sky, beautiful mountain, and the finest—" "Oh, shut up," yelled the clod. "Shut up yourself," put in the old woman of 20. "Let him talk. They are good melons." For some unknown reason, everybody laughed at that, in various keys and tempers, and the mood of the sweating toilers brightened a little. Presently the overseer strolled over from the gate, and the melon-pickers applied themselves with ostentatious diligence. He paused beside Marcellus, who looked up inquiringly. Vibiscus jerked his head toward the villa. "He wants to see you," he said gruffly. Marcellus nodded, picked up his laden basket in his arms, and poured out a few into the old man's basket. Then he gave some to the worn-out girl, who raised her eyes in a smile that was almost pretty. On up the line of workers he distributed his melons, emptying the last dozen of them into the basket of the oaf who had derided him. The sullen fellow pulled an embarrassed grin. "Will you be coming back?" squeaked the old man. "I hope so, sir," said Marcellus. "It is pleasant work and good company." "Oh, it's sir you are now, old one," teased the oaf. Much boisterous laughter rewarded this sally. The girl with the scowl did not join in the applause. "What's paining you, Metella?" yelled the witty one. She turned on him angrily. "It's a pity that a stranger can't show us a little decent respect without being cackled at." As Marcellus turned to go, he gave her an approving wink that smoothed out the scowl and sent a flush through the tan. A dozen pairs of eyes followed him as he moved away at the sight of Vibiscus, who had been an impatient spectator.
"They're not out here to joke and play,"
mumbled Vibiscus. "You'd get more melons picked," advised Marcellus. "People work better when they're happy, don't you think so?"
"I don't know,"
said Vibiscus.
"I never saw anybody work who was happy."
He lengthened his steps.
"You'd better stretch your legs, fellow. Queso isn't good at waiting."
"He's probably as good at waiting as I am at hurrying," replied Marcellus dryly.
"You don't know Queso,"
muttered Vibiscus with an ominous chuckle.
"He doesn't coddle people, only horses."
"I can believe that," said Marcellus. Throwing the old bag over his shoulder, he strolled out to the highway, tarried for another look at the mountain, and sauntered up the hill. Queso was at his desk when Marcellus was shown in. He was making a showy pretense of being busily engaged and did not glance up. After Marcellus had stood waiting before the desk for what seemed to him a long time without receiving any attention, he turned away and walked over to a window that looked out upon a flower garden.
"You say you are a scrivener?"
called Queso sharply. "No, sir." Marcellus slowly retraced his steps. "Your man asked me if I could read, write, and compute. I can do that. But I'm not a scrivener by profession."
How much do you want?"
"You will know, sir, how much my services are worth to you. I shall accept what you think is just."
"I gave the last man 10 sesterces and his keep."
"It seems a trifling wage," observed Marcellus.
"But if you cannot afford to pay more—"
"It's not a question of what I can afford," retorted Queso pompously. "It's a question of what you will take."
"I shouldn't have thought that a proud and successful man like you, sir, would want a stranger to donate part of his time to serving you. You called me a beggar an hour ago, in a tone indicating that you had no respect for beggars. Perhaps I misunderstood you." Queso pushed his folded arms halfway across the desk and glared up into Marcellus's complacent eyes. He appeared to be contemplating a savage rejoinder, but impulsively changed his tactics.
"I'll give you 20,
he grumbled.
"And let me tell you something."
His voice was rising to an angry pitch.
"There's to be no shirking, and no mistakes, and no—"
"Just a moment," broke in Marcellus coolly. "Let me tell you something. You have a bad habit of screaming at people. I can't believe you get any pleasure out of terrorizing others who can't help themselves. It's just a habit, but it's a hateful habit, and I don't like it. And you're not to indulge in it when you're addressing me." Queso rubbed his jaw with the back of his hand.
"Nobody ever dared to talk to me like that," he smoldered.
"I don't know why I let you do it." "I'll gladly tell you." Marcellus laid his hands flat on the desk and leaned far forward with a confidential smile. "You have accumulated a great deal of property and power, but you are not contented. There is something you lack, something you would like to have. You are not sure what it is, but you think I know. That is why you sent for me to come back, Queso."
"I sent for you, fellow."
Queso was wagging his head truculently.
"Because I need a scrivener."
"Well, I'm not a scrivener," drawled Marcellus, turning away. "And you're shouting again. If you'll excuse me, I'll go back to the melon field. I found some very companionable people out there."
"What? Companionable? Those melon pickers?"
rasped Queso.
"They're a pack of dirty, lazy thieves."
"Not naturally, I think," said Marcellus judicially. "But for their extreme poverty and drudgery, they might be quite decent and industrious and honest. Just as you, sir, might be a very charming person if you had no opportunity to be a bully."
"See here, fellow," snarled Queso. "Are you going out there to gabble with these idlers, and try to make them believe they're unjustly treated?"
"No. Any man who works from dawn to dusk at hard labor for 3 sesterces will not need to be told that he's getting bad treatment."
"So, they've been complaining, eh?"
"Not to me, sir. When I left them, I thought they were in quite a merry mood."
What have they got to be merry about?"
Queso pushed back his chair, rose, and opening a tall cabinet in the corner, drew out a large sheaf of papyrus sheets and an armful of scrolls. Dumping the correspondence on his desk, he pointed to it significantly.
"Sit down,"
he commanded.
"Take up that stylus, and I'll tell you how to reply to these letters. They are orders from markets and great houses in Rome for melons and grapes and pears. You will read them to me, and I shall tell you what to say, and have a care. I do not read, but I will know what they are saying."
Disinclined to argue, and alive with curiosity to see what might come of this unfamiliar business, Marcellus sat down and began to read the letters aloud. Queso seemed childishly pleased. He was selling melons. Cartloads and cartloads of choice Arpino melons, and getting a top price for them. And advance orders for grapes in August. Presently Marcellus came upon a letter written in Greek, and started to read it in that language.
"Ah, that Greek," snorted Queso. "I do not understand. What does it say?"
And when Marcellus had translated it, he inquired with something like respect,
"You write Greek too? That is good."
He rubbed his hands with satisfaction. It would be pleasant to let these great ones know that he could afford to have a scholar for a scrivener. When the letters were ended, he remarked irrelevantly,
"We will find you a better tunic."
"I have a better tunic, thank you," said Marcellus, without looking up.
"Is it that you like flowers?"
asked Queso, after they had finished for the day, and when Marcellus had nodded, he said condescendingly,
"The scrivener is permitted to walk in the gardens of the villa. If you like horses, you may visit my stables."
"Very gracious of you, sir," said Marcellus absently. Antonia Queso was at least a dozen years younger than her husband. But for her tightly pursed mouth and unlighted eyes, she might have been considered attractive, for her features were nicely moulded, her figure was shapely, and her tone was refined. Marcellus, encountering her among the roses with garden shears and a basket, had reason for surmising that she was a victim of repression. She greeted him casually, unsmilingly, remarking in a flat monotone that she supposed he must be her husband's new scrivener. Marcellus admitted this, adding that he was pleased to find employment in such a pleasant environment, which drew a sidelong, bitter smile from her eyes, a smile in which her lips had no share. "You mean the flowers and the mountain?" she said. "Yes, they are beautiful." He was for sauntering on, seeing that his permission to walk in the garden had not included the right to a leisurely chat with the mistress of the villa, but the enigmatic wife of Queso detained him. "What is your name, scrivener?" "My husband did not say." "Marcellus Galio." "There is a senator of that name, Galio." She was cutting the half-opened roses with long stems and tossing them at random toward the basket. Marcellus stopped and began arranging them in orderly fashion. "Yes, that is true," he said. "Are you related?" she asked, much occupied with her task. Marcellus laughed self-deprecatingly. Would a humble scrivener be related to a senator? He countered. "Probably not," she agreed coolly. "But you are not a humble scrivener. You are patrician." She straightened up and faced him with level eyes. "It's in your voice, in your face, in your carriage." The short upper lip showed a row of pretty teeth as she pointed with her shears. "Look at your hands. They're not accustomed to work of any kind. Don't be alarmed," she went on with a little shrug. "I won't give you away, though that silk tunic may. Weren't you rather indiscreet to put it on? I saw you in the other one this morning from my window. Wherever did you find it?" She was stooping low, busy with her shears. "How'd you like this masquerading as a scrivener, Marcellus Galio? Are you sure you aren't related to the senator?" "He is my father," said Marcellus. "I believe that," she replied, turning her face toward him with an honest smile. "But why do you tell me?" "Because you seem to like frankness, and because I prefer to tell the truth. I have not tried to deceive your husband. He did not ask my name. But I think you would be pleased if he did not know. Yes, I should prefer that he does not know." "That is unfortunate," she said ironically. "You are robbing Appius Queso of much pleasure. Were he able to say that he had the son of a senator for his scrivener, he would be unbearably exalted." "Perhaps you don't understand Queso," soothed Marcellus. "I don't understand Queso?" she exclaimed. "By all the gods, that is my occupation, understanding Queso." "He requires special handling, my friend," declared Marcellus. "Queso is immensely proud of his power over all these people in Arpino. They obey him because they fear him. He could have even more power over them if they obeyed him because they liked him. Imagine Queso doing anything to make them like him," she scoffed. "I can imagine it," rejoined Marcellus quietly.
And if we can induce him to make the experiment, it will greatly improve the atmosphere of this place. Would you like to cooperate with me?" "It's much too late," she objected. "Queso could never win their friendship, no matter what he might do for them. And you must remember that the common labourers of Arpino are a dirty, ignorant lot." "They are dirty," agreed Marcellus. "And you can't expect dirty people to be decent. They antagonize one another because each man despises himself, and no wonder. I was thinking about that this morning. These people should have bathing facilities. There's not much temptation to get into this ice-cold mountain stream. It should not be much of a task to build a large swimming pool and let the hot sun warm the water. There's a quarry hard by. The people could construct the pool themselves, in the idle interval between the melons and the grapes, if they had any encouragement." "Ah, you don't know the Arpinos," protested the wife of Queso. "If they are worse than other people, there must be a reason," said Marcellus. "I wonder what it is." "Why should you care, Marcellus Galio?" A handsome youth in his early teens was strolling toward them. There was no question about his identity. His resemblance to his mother was so striking as to bring a smile. "Your son, I think," said Marcellus. "Antony," she murmured, with an ecstatic little sigh. "He is my life. He wants to be a sculptor. His father does not approve and will not consent to his having instruction. He is such a lonely, unhappy child. Come here, Antony, and meet the new scrivener, Marcellus Galio." "Your mother tells me you are fond of modelling," said Marcellus, when Antony had mumbled an indifferent greeting. "Would you like to let me see what you are doing?" Antony screwed up a sensitive mouth. "Would you know anything about it?" he asked, with his mother's disconcerting candour. "Enough to make a few suggestions, perhaps." Antony couldn't wait until morning, but went to the scrivener's quarters after dinner, carrying the model he had been working on, 2 gladiators poised for action. He put it down on Marcellus's table and backed off from it, shyly, murmuring that he knew it wasn't much. "It's not at all bad, Antony," commended Marcellus. "The composition is good. The man on this side is a foolhardy fellow, though, to take that stance. What are their names?" Suspecting that he was being teased, Antony grinned and said he hadn't named them. "To do your best work on them," said Marcellus seriously, "they must have personality. You should consider them as real people, and know all about them. Let us attend to that first, shall we?" He drew up a chair for Antony, and they sat facing the model. "Now, the man on this side is Cyprius. The legionaries captured him down in Crete, burned his house down, drove off his cattle, murdered his wife and son, a boy about your age, and took him to Rome in a prison ship. He was an excellent swordsman, so they gave him his choice of dueling in the arena or pulling an oar in a galley. So he chose the arena, and now he is fighting for his life, hoping to kill this other man whom he never saw before." "Oh, you're just making that up," accused Antony glumly. "Yes, but that's the way these duels are staged in the arena, Antony, between men who must kill or be killed. Now, your other man is a Thracian. His name is Galenzo. He had a little farm and a vineyard, and some goats, and 3 small children. His wife tried to hide him in the hay when the legionaries came, but they struck her down before the children's eyes and dragged Galenzo away on a chain. He fought so hard that they sold him to a praetor who needed gladiators for the games at the Feast of Isis. Now Cyprius and Galenzo are fighting, so the people may have a chance to lay wagers on which one will kill the other. How are you betting, Antony? I shall risk 100 sesterces on Galenzo. I don't like the way Cyprius stands." "I hadn't thought of betting," said Antony dispiritedly. He turned to Marcellus with pouting lips. "You don't like fighting, do you?" "Not that kind." "Maybe you never fought," challenged Antony. "Maybe you would be afraid to fight." "Maybe," rejoined Marcellus, undisturbed by the boy's impudence. "I'll take that back," spluttered Antony. "I don't think you'd be afraid to fight. I'll bet you could. Did you ever?" "Not in the arena." "Did you ever kill anyone, sir?" Marcellus postponed his reply so long that Antony knew his question could have but one answer. His eyes were bright with anticipation of an exciting story. "Did he put up a good fight, sir?" "It is not a pleasant recollection," said Marcellus. There was an interval of silence. "I wish you had chosen some other subject for your model, Antony. I'm not much interested in this one." He suddenly invaded Antony's moody eyes. "Nor are you, my boy. You're not the type that goes in for slaughter. You don't believe in it, you don't like it, and if you had it to do, it would turn your stomach, isn't that so?"
Antony explored the inside of his cheek with a defenseless tongue, and slowly nodded his head. "It's worse than that," he confessed. "I would be afraid to fight. Maybe that's why I draw pictures of fighting, and make models of gladiators, just trying to pretend." He hung his head morosely. "I haven't a scrap of courage," he went on. "It makes me ashamed." "Well, I'm not so sure about that," consoled Marcellus. "There are many different kinds of courage, Antony. You've just come through with the best kind there is, the courage to tell the truth. It required much more bravery to say what you've just said than it takes to black another man's eye." Antony raised his head and brightened a little. "Let's start another model," he suggested. "Very well. I shall try to think of something that we both might enjoy. Come back early in the morning. If you will lend me some clay, perhaps I may have a rough sketch to show you when you come." Antony laughed merrily. Marcellus had made a rectangular swimming pool. Seated on the stone ledge at intervals were figures of bathers, men, women, and children. One thin old man had an absurdly long beard tossed over his shoulder. A tiny baby on all fours was about to tumble in. Its mother was coming at full gallop. The large feet and bony legs of a diver protruded from the immobile water. "You didn't do all this morning," said Antony. "No, I worked on it most of the night. It's just a beginning, you see. We need many more people sitting around the pool and diving and swimming." "Would you like to complete it?" "It would be fun, I think," said Antony. "You can give it a lot of detail. Move it to a much larger modelling board and you will have room to do some landscaping. Remember that big rock down by the bridge, where there's a natural basin? You might put in the bridge and the rock and the acacia trees. Then everybody would know where the pool is." "I say, sir, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a pool like that." After a week's acquaintance with his new duties, Marcellus was able to complete his day's work by mid-afternoon. Antony would be loitering in the atrium, restlessly passing and repassing the open door to the library. Queso had observed this growing attachment, not without some satisfaction.
"They tell me you are helping to amuse my son," he remarked. "Don't feel that you must if it's a burden. You have plenty of work to do."
Marcellus had assured him that he enjoyed Antony's company, that the boy had artistic talent, that he needed encouragement, and when Queso had derided art as a profession, an argument arose.
"I can't think of a real man who would want to waste his time playing with mud," said Queso scornfully.
"Clay," corrected Marcellus, unruffled. "Modelling clay. There's as much difference between mud and clay as there is between Arpino melons and ordinary melons. It is not unnatural, sir, a man's desire to create something beautiful. Antony may become an able sculptor."
"Sculptor," sneered Queso. "And of what use is a sculptor?"
Marcellus had made no reply to that. He continued putting away his accounts and desk implements, with a private smile that stirred Queso's curiosity, and when queried, remarked that Antony probably came by it naturally. "You, sir," he exclaimed, "have created a successful business. Your son can hardly hope to improve upon it. It is complete. He too wants to create something. You have bequeathed him his ambition, and now you resent him having a desire that he inherited from you." Queso, purring with self-satisfaction, twirled his thumbs and grinned for more. Marcellus obliged him. Many sculptors starved to death before they were well enough known to earn a living by their art. Antony would not have to starve. His father was rich and should take pride in his son's ability. Appius Queso had made his name important in commerce. Antony Queso might make his name mean as much in the field of art. You don't want Antony to be unhappy and unsuccessful when he might easily make you proud of him. Show him a little attention, sir, and you'll discover you have a loyal and affectionate son.
"Ah, the boy has always been cold and disdainful," complained Queso, "like his mother."
"If I may venture to contradict you," said Marcellus, "Antony is a very warm-hearted youngster. You could have his love if you wanted it. Why not come along with me now, sir, and have a look at something he's making?" Grumbling that he had no interest in such nonsense, Queso had accompanied him to Antony's room. They stood before the model in silence, Antony visibly nervous and expectant of derision. Queso studied the elaborate scene, rubbed his jaw, chuckled a little and shook his head. Antony, watching his father with pathetic wistfulness, sighed dejectedly.
"It's in the wrong place. declared Queso. "When the snow melts, the spring freshets come plunging through that hollow. It would tear your masonry out. You must build it on higher ground."
With that, Marcellus said he had an errand, if they would excuse him, and left the room. He sauntered down the hall and out through the peristyle, wearing a smile of such dimensions that when he encountered Antonia, she insisted on knowing what had happened. Her eyes widened with unbelief as he told her briefly that her husband and her son were conferring about the best place to build a swimming pool. "Shall I join them?" she asked childishly. "No, not this time," said Marcellus. It was mid-July now. At sunset every day, Marcellus went down to the melon field and sat by the gate where the workers from all the fields received their wages. For a while the people merely waved a hand and smiled as they passed him. Then some of them ventured to tarry and talk. The scrivener, they all agreed, was indeed a queer one, but there was something about him that inclined them to him. They had a feeling that he was on their side. For one thing, there was this rumor that they were to have a swimming pool. When the last of the melons were harvested, anyone who wished to work on the community pool could do so. Nobody knew how much would be paid for this labor, but they were to be paid. Everybody felt that the scrivener had been responsible for this project. Some of the bolder ones asked him about it, and he professed not to know much of the plan, which he said was Appius Caeso's idea, and they would be told all about it when the time came. One afternoon, when fully a score of workers had gathered about him, Marcellus told them a story about a man he knew in a faraway country, who had important things to say to poor people with heavy burdens, and how he believed that a man's life did not consist of the things he owned, and how much unhappiness could be avoided if men did not covet other men's possessions. If you want to be happy, make other people happy. He paused, and found himself looking squarely into Metella's eyes, pleased to see them so softly responsive.
"And what did this Jesus do to make other people happy?" asked an old man.
Well, in the case of Jesus, Marcellus had explained, he wasn't just an ordinary man, for he performed remarkable deeds of healing. He could make blind men see. People had but to touch him, and they were cured of their diseases. It was dark that evening before the melon workers trudged up the hill. Reproaching himself for having detained them so long, Marcellus had said, "If you want to hear more stories about Jesus, let us meet tomorrow in the village after you have your supper." And so it had become a daily event for Marcellus to meet the people of Arpino on the grassy knoll at the foot of the mountain. He told them of the great, surging crowds that had followed Jesus, told them with much detail about the miracles, about little Jonathan's foot and the story of the donkey that the lad gave to his crippled friend. He told them about Miriam's voice and the broken loom that Jesus had mended, and how the woman had woven him a robe. They had sat motionless, hardly breathing, until darkness fell. All Arpino looked forward to these evening stories and discussed them in the fields next day. Even Vobiscus came and listened. One evening Antonia and Antony appeared at the edge of the crowd while Marcellus was telling them about the feeding of 5,000 people from a small boy's lunch basket. It was a story of many moods, and the Arpinos laughed and wept over it. And then there was the great storm that Jesus had stilled with a soothing word.
"I hear you've been entertaining the people with strange stories," remarked Queso next day.
"About a great teacher, sir," explained Marcellus, "and his deeds for the relief of the people in the provinces of Palestine."
"What kind of deeds?"
pursued Queso. And when Marcellus had told him a few of the miracle stories, he said, "Did this Jesus deal only with the poor?" "By no means," said Marcellus. "He had friends among the rich, and was frequently invited to their houses. You might be interested, sir, in something that happened at the house of a wealthy man named Zacchaeus."
"Divided half his money among the poor, eh?" remarked Queso when the story was finished. "Much thanks he got for that, I suppose."
"I don't know," said Marcellus. "I dare say the only way you could find out how people would act in such a case—"
"Divide your money with them and see, eh?" grumbled Queso.
"Well, you might make a little experiment that wouldn't cost quite so much," said Marcellus soberly. "For example, have Vobiscus pay everybody 4 sesterces instead of 3 from now to the end of the melon season."
"Then they'd raise a row if we went back to the old wage," protested Queso.
"Very likely," agreed Marcellus. "Maybe it isn't worth doing. It would probably just stir up trouble."
"Vobiscus would think I'd gone crazy," exclaimed Queso.
"Not if you increase his wages too." Vobiscus is a valuable man, sir, and very loyal. He isn't paid enough."
"Did he say so?"
snapped Queso. "No, Vobiscus wouldn't complain to me."
"He has never asked for more?"
"That does not mean he's getting enough."
"Perhaps you will be wanting better wages too."
Queso chuckled unpleasantly. "Vobiscus gets 6 sesterces. Let us pay him 10, and I will be content with 16 instead of 20.
"Very well," said Queso. "You're a fool, but if that's the way you want it—"
"With one stipulation, sir. Vobiscus is not to know how his raise in wages came about. Let him think you did it and see what happens." Queso took much pride in the pool, and admitted that he was glad the idea had occurred to him to build it. The people didn't know what had come over Queso, but they believed the same thing was happening to him that had happened to them. He even conceded to Marcellus that the sesterces he had added to the worker's wage might have had something to do with the gratifying fact that there had been a surprisingly small loss lately on melons bruised by careless handling. Marcellus did not tell him that he had made a speech the next morning after their pay was increased, in which he had suggested that they show their appreciation by being more faithful to their employer's interests. The grapes were ripening now, and Queso enjoyed strolling through the vineyards. Sometimes the older ones ventured to turn their heads in his direction and smile rather shyly. One afternoon he heard them singing as he came down the road. When he appeared at the gate, the song stopped. He asked Vobiscus.
"They thought it might annoy you, sir,"
stammered Vobiscus.
"Let them sing, let them sing,"
shouted Queso indignantly.
"What makes them think I don't want them to sing?"
Vobiscus was clean-shaven today and carrying himself with an air. Yesterday the wife of Queso had called at his house to show his wife a tapestry pattern and ask her how she had dyed the shawl she wore last night. Near the end of a day, when Marcellus had said he was going to stroll down to the vineyards, Antony asked if he might go along. At the gate, Marcellus picked up a couple of baskets and handed one to Antony. "Want to do me a little favour?" he asked. "Come along, and we'll gather some grapes." "Why should we?" inquired Antony. "What will they think of us?"
"They will think no less of us," said Marcellus.
"And it will make them think better of themselves and their work." Presently they came upon an old woman who was straining hard to lift her heavy basket up to the platform of a cart. The driver, lounging against the wheel, watched her lazily. "Give her a hand, Antony," said Marcellus quietly. Everybody in that vicinity stopped work for a moment to witness this strange sight. The elegant son of Queso, who they had all thought considered the people of Arpino as dirt under his dainty feet, had volunteered to share a labourer's burden. There was a spontaneous murmur of approval as Marcellus and Antony moved on. "Thank you, Antony," said Marcellus in a low tone. "I didn't mind giving her a lift," said Antony, flushing as he noted the appreciative smiles of the workers. "You gave everybody a lift," said Marcellus. "Including yourself, I think." When August was more than half gone, and the orders for fruit had dwindled until the scrivener's duties for the season were of small importance, Marcellus told Queso that he would like to be on his way.
"How about staying on for a while to help Antony with his modelling?" suggested Queso.
"I have shown him almost everything I know," said Marcellus.
"Nonsense," scoffed Queso. "He can learn much from you. Besides, you're good for him. Antony's a different boy. You're making a man of him."
"That's your doing, Queso," said Marcellus gently. "Can't you see the way Antony hangs on your words? He admires you greatly, sir. It should be your own privilege to make a man of him."
"Will you come back to Arpino next summer?"
asked Queso, almost entreatingly. Marcellus expressed his gratitude for the invitation, but did not know where he might be next summer. Finishing his work at the desk, he was more painstaking than usual in filing things away, Queso moodily watching him.
"When are you leaving?"
he asked. "Early in the morning, sir. I'm going to Rome." Queso followed him out into the garden, where they met Antonia. In her presence he invited Marcellus to dine with the family. Antonia smiled her approval.
"He is leaving us," said Queso. "Where is Antony? I shall tell him."
He turned back toward the house. "Aren't you contented here, Marcellus?" asked Antonia gently, after a little silence between them. "Haven't we done everything you wished?" "Yes, that's why I'm going." She nodded understandingly and gave him a pensive smile. "Marcellus, do you remember the story you told us about the people's belief in Cana, was it? That Jesus had changed water into wine. You found that hard to believe, I think, he said. No, she murmured. I can believe that story. It is no more mysterious than the changes you have made in Arpino. That evening, according to their recent custom, all the villagers assembled on the knoll to wait for Marcellus to appear and tell them a story. When he came, Caeso and Antonia and Antony were with him. Sitting down in the open circle the people had left for him, Marcellus hesitated for a long moment before beginning to speak. You have all been very kind to me, he said, and you will be much in my thoughts wherever I may go. A disappointed little sigh went over the crowd. I have told you many stories about this strange man of Galilee, who befriended the poor and helpless. Tonight I shall tell you one more story about him, the strangest story of them all. Let that be my parting gift to you. It was a sad story of a misunderstood man forsaken at the last even by his frightened friends. A dismaying story of an unfair trial and a cruel death, and Marcellus told it so impressively that most of his audience was in tears. Now there was nothing so strange about that, he went on, in a suddenly altered mood, for wise men have always been misunderstood and persecuted, and many of them have been slain, as Jesus was. But Jesus came to life again.
What? No,
shouted an old man in a quavering voice. They hushed him down and waited for Marcellus to go on. In the tense silence, the amazing story proceeded. Jesus was in the world, alive, to remain until his kingdom of kindness should rule all men, everywhere. You need not weep for him, declared Marcellus. He asks no pity. If you want to do something to aid him, be helpful to one another, and await his coming.
Where is he now, sir?
Called the old man shrilly. No one knows, said Marcellus. He might appear anywhere, any time. We must not be found doing anything that would grieve him if he should come upon us suddenly, at an hour when we are not expecting him. Will you keep that in your remembrance? The twilight was falling fast now, and so was the dew. It was time they dispersed. Marcellus drew a folded, much-handled sheet of papyrus from the breast of his tunic, and held it up in the fading light. One day, he said, when a great company of Galileans had assembled about him on a hilltop, Jesus talked to them quietly about what he called the blessed life. My friend Justus remembered these words and recited them for me. I wrote them down. Let me read them to you, and then we will part. The Arpinos leaned forward to listen, all but Metella, who sat hugging her knees with her face buried in her folded arms. A deep hush fell over them as Marcellus read. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Rejoice and be glad, for great will be your reward. Rising before dawn, Marcellus slipped quietly out of the villa, meeting no one, except Metella, who startled him by stepping out of the shrubbery near the gate to say farewell in a tremulous little voice. Then she had started to scamper away. He spoke her name softly. Taking her toil-toughened hands, he said tenderly, Metella, you are indeed a faithful friend. I shall always remember you. Please, she sobbed. Take good care of yourself, Marcellus. And then, abruptly tearing loose from him, she had disappeared in the dark. It was with a strange sense of elation that he strode along the foothill road in the shadow of the mountain as a pink sunrise lighted the sky. Last night, after taking leave of the Caeso family, who had made an earnest effort to dissuade him, he had gone to bed with misgivings. He was happy in Arpino. He knew he had been sent there on a mission. Lately, something kept telling him his work was done, telling him he must go to Rome. All night, with the entreaties of young Antony still sounding in his ears, He kept asking himself, why am I going to Rome? This morning, his anxieties had been put aside. He did not know why he was headed toward Rome, but the reason would appear in due time. He had never been able to explain to himself why, when he had been washed up by the tide on the Capua beach, he had turned his face toward Arpino, or why, tarrying at Caso's melon field, he had accepted employment. It was almost as if he were being led about by an invisible hand. By mid-afternoon, the winding road had angled away from the mountain range and was being joined and widened by many tributaries. It was becoming a busy highway now, drawing in all manner of laden carts and wagons from the gates and lanes of the fertile valley. The day was hot and the air was heavy with dust. Scowling drivers lashed their donkeys cruelly and yelled obscenities as they contended for the right of way. Every added mile increased the confusion and sharpened the ostentatious brutality of the men who pressed toward Rome. It was as if the imperial city had reached out her malevolent arms in all directions to clutch and pollute her victims as they moved into the orbit of her fetid breath. And they, ashamed of their rustic simplicities, had sought to appear urbane by cursing one another. Marcellus, making his way past this ill-tempered cavalcade, wondered whether many people could be found in Rome who would care to hear about the man of Galilee. Arriving in the good-sized town of Alatri at sundown, Marcellus found the only tavern buzzing with excitement. An agitated crowd milled about in the stable yard. Inside, there was barely standing room. He made his way in and asked the tall man, wedged beside him, what was going on. The news had just come from Rome that Prince Gaius was dead. At this juncture, the tavern-keeper stood up on a chair and announced importantly that all who did not wish to be served should get out and make way for his guests. Most of the shabby ones sullenly withdrew. In the corner of the room, 3 flashily dressed wool buyers from Rome sat at a table, laving the day's dust with a flagon of wine. Crowded about them was an attentive audience, eager for further details concerning the tragedy. Marcellus pressed close and listened. Last night there had been a banquet at the palatial home of Tribune Quintus and his wife Celia, the niece of Sejanus, in honor of young Caligula, the son of Germanicus, who had just arrived from Gaul. Prince Gaius had been taken suddenly ill at dinner and had died within an hour. The wool merchants, conscious of their attentive auditors, and growing less discreet as they replenished their cups from the second flagon, continued to discuss the event with a knowledgeable air, almost as if they had been present at the fateful banquet. It was evident that they were well informed on court gossip, as indeed anyone in Rome could be if he made friends with servants. There was little doubt, declared the woolmen, that the prince had been poisoned. He had been in the best of health. The sickness had been swift and savage. Suspicion had not centered definitely on anyone. Tribune Tullus, who in the afternoon had married the young daughter of Senator Galio, sister of Tribune Marcellus, the one who drowned himself in the sea a few weeks ago, had spoken some hot words to the prince earlier in the evening, but they had both been so drunk that little importance had been attached to the argument. Old Sejanus had sat opposite the prince at dinner, and everybody knew that old Sejanus had no use for Gaius. But it was agreed that if the crafty old man had wanted to assassinate the prince, he had too much sense to risk it in such circumstances.
"How does it happen that Quintus can live in a palace and give expensive dinners?" inquired the tavern-keeper, anxious to show that he knew a thing or two about the great ones. "Old Tuscus, his father, is not rich. What did Quintus ever do to make a fortune? He has led no expeditions." The wool merchants exchanged knowing glances and shrugged superiorly. "Quintus and the prince are great friends," said the fat one who presided over the flagon. "You mean the prince and Quintus's wife are great friends?"
recklessly chuckled the one with the silver trinkets on his bandeau.
"Oh-ho!" divined the tavern-keeper. "Maybe that's how it happened."
"Not so fast, wise man," admonished the eldest of the 3 thickly. "Quintus was not present at the banquet. He had been sent at the last minute to Capri."
"Who did it, then?"
persisted the tavern-keeper.
"Well, that's what everybody wants to know,"
said the fat one, holding up the empty flagon.
"Here, fill that up and don't ask so many questions."
He glanced about over the silent group, his eyes tarrying for a moment as they passed Marcellus. "We're all talking too freely," he muttered. Marcellus turned away, followed by the tavern-keeper,
and inquired for a bath and a room for the night. A servant showed him to his cramped and cheerless quarters, and he began tossing off his clothes. So, Diana need not worry about Gaius's attentions any more. That was a great relief. Who would rule Rome now? Perhaps the Emperor would appoint tight-pursed old Sejanus to the regency for the present. So, Gaius had been poisoned, eh? Perhaps Celia had done it. Maybe Gaius had mistreated her. He couldn't be loyal to anyone, not for very long. But no, Celia wouldn't have done it. More likely that Quintus had left instructions with a servant, and had contrived some urgent business at Capri to provide an alibi. Quintus could dispose of the servant easily enough. Marcellus wondered if Quintus had encountered Demetrius at Capri. Well, if he had, Demetrius could take care of himself very nicely. So Lucia was married. That was good. She'd always been in love with Tullus. Marcellus fell to speculating on the possibility that Lucia might have confided to her husband the story of Gaius's crude attempts to make love to her when she was little more than a child. If she had, and if Tullus were drunk enough to be foolhardy, but no, Tullus wouldn't get drunk enough to do a thing like that. Tullus would have used a dagger. Marcellus reverted to Celia, trying to remember everything he could about her. The restless, sultry eyes, the sly, preoccupied smile that always made her manner seem older than her slim, girlish body. Yes, Celia might have done it. She was a deep one, like her uncle Sejanus. Well, whatever had caused the prince's indigestion, the dangerous reptile was dead. That was a comfort. Perhaps Rome might now hope for a little better government. It was inconceivable that the empire could acquire a worse ruler than Gaius Drusus Agrippa.